So we're publishing literary fiction translated from Asian languages, the kinds of languages where you don't really get much at all in this country. And it was, again, a similar impulse to translation myself, to fill a certain niche, and done in the spirit of not, charitably, let us read these other people's writing, but translation into a language and a literature is the lifeblood of English. And English needs to be constantly renewed by giving not only readers but writers access to these other traditions and these other possibilities. And so for us, it's being non-profit, it's being independent, and it's being led actually by translators, which is how we find most of the books that we publish. So it's not necessarily us going out there with, this is our idea of literature, this is what we want, can you fit in with that? It's asking people who really have their ear to the ground in these places and are passionate and are considering, issues of representation as well as just what has commercial potential. So we're doing things like Thai and Uzbek, where it's literally the first translation of at least contemporary fiction from those languages published in this country. And also that idea of contemporaneity, and also work that is not quite on the commercial end of the spectrum. It's a different narrative. It's not really sort of straight chronological realism. And part of that was wanting to redress this idea that literature from outside of Europe tends to get read more anthropologically than as art. And so we're publishing, things that are surreal or experimental, or that are at least innovative in some way, because I find that is easier to market to readers as, read this book not to necessarily primarily learn about an other culture or even have something being seen as other, but read it just in the same way that you would read any other book, not in translated from French or Russian. There doesn't need to be that sort of difference of value. I guess the short-term goal would be to see more translations altogether, so not just from us, but for other publishers to see that, yes, you can be successful doing these kinds of books. Even before The Vegetarian was published, people weren't sure how well a South Korean novel could do, but when you think of it not in terms of just limiting it to its nationality, then that issue completely falls away. And the other thing that I wanted to shake up particularly was around women. So we said from the beginning that at least 50% of our list would be by women. And along with And Other Stories, we've also signed up to doing the Year of Publishing Women in 2018, having since discovered, actually, when we looked at our lists, that we've already done a Year of Publishing Women this year as well, because we like women so much. But trying to think of it from an intersectional perspective. So the context in different countries, particularly in Asia, around women's participation in literature is very different. Something like South Korea is almost an anomaly in that there are more big name writers who are women than men. And there are other countries and regions of countries like South India where the literary establishment is still very much a patriarchy, and that affects what will be published there, what will be recommended, or will manage to sort of make it through to the UK as well. And so we're hoping that by giving female writers a platform here and the prestige of being published in English, as much as it's problematic that English is where the prestige lies in world literature, given that we can't change that overnight, it feels like it's useful to use that to hopefully effect at least a bit of a mental change in some of the places that we're publishing from. Translation is an act of reading in the sense that it is interpretive, but that doesn't necessarily stop the spirit of the original from coming through. that's not a negative sense, that translation is a personal act and that every individual translator will bring something different to the book, because that's exactly what the reader will do as well. And I think as well there's something wonderfully open about that whole collaboration, the process of translating somebody else's writing. But also as a reader, you don't necessarily feel that the original is, teaching you something or telling you something. You're not sort of lower than it. It's a very equal relationship. And I think when you get to work with writers who really understand that, that is the best outcome. In a sense, it was quite random. I had no connection with Korean at all. I'd never met a Korean person or eaten Korean food. But it was the lack of translations, mainly. I read a lot in translation, and Korean was one of the languages where I'd never actually found a book translated into English before. And it was also the mystery. I think at the time when I started learning the language in 2010, it wasn't studied in this country very much at all. Gangnam Style had not happened. Nobody really knew anything about Korea. So I was interested in finding out, and it has turned out to be a useful niche. Bizarrely, the first job in publishing that I have had is as the sort of founder / head of Tilted Axis, and that was because coming from a working class background in the north of England, that was actually more feasible than getting a job in an existing structure. But a lot of that is changing now, so we have paid internships. A lot of other, even independent small presses do as well. And I think that the most important thing about having a more diverse workforce in publishing itself is that it will, break down this idea of representation and a lot of the stereotypes that are around publishing from certain countries, certain regions. You tend to get a very narrow range of narratives are allowed through. And a lot of that is because the gatekeepers, in a sense, even unconsciously, a lot of it is around what people identify with and what they are able to imagine from their experience of the world. And then the other side of that is audience. Literary translation, literary fiction, publishing in this country is a very white middle class thing. Experimental, intellectual, challenging, foreign, weird, strange books are for anybody from any walk of life, and they can decide whether it's for them or not. We shouldn't be excluding them. So that would be the biggest change. With Korean, I'm sort of reassured every so often when I attempt to Google translate something from Korean and the English is, maybe marginally less incomprehensible than it was the last time I tried it, but it really doesn't work very well at all. So I'm not worried about being put out of my job in that sense. So next year will be our first full year. We started sort of halfway through this year. We did 3 books. I constantly want to publish more books. I constantly am horrified by how much work is involved in publishing the tiny number that we do at the minute. The most exciting thing for me at the moment is for 2018, because we're doing this year of publishing women, we decided that there's no point just publishing books by women again. We do that already. That's not sort of radical enough in itself. So we're hoping to do a series of chapbooks, of some poetry, some other sort of more interesting, smaller forms that might otherwise fall through the gaps, bring in some different languages, and also to do some sort of tie-in events to contextualize some of that, generally around the theme of translating feminisms, which is actually inspired by one of the world's festivals here that I came to before, where a poet from the Kannada language in India spoke about what it was like being labelled a feminist in her own regional context, and how that does or does not translate onto an international stage, and when you're moving between languages. And given that feminism is such a talked about thing at the moment, particularly in publishing as well, I don't want to be bringing, our own ideas of feminism onto other people's work. I want to see what is going on in these other literary traditions and contexts and try and use that to inform what we're doing. So that is the most exciting thing that I'm looking forward to.